Welcome everyone to the 2020 CBMS Mathematics Alignment Forum. I'm Diane Bryers, the immediate past chair of CBMS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today. Thank you for attending, and most importantly, thank you for all the hard work that you're doing in your states to improve mathematics alignment from high school to college. We very much appreciate the work that you've been doing over the past 18 months and the work that you're going to continue to do. We also want to start with a thank you to our sponsors, Microsoft Education, Carnegie Corporation of America, National Science Foundation, COMAP, and Texas Instruments. Without their support, none of this important work would have been possible. So to get us started this morning, since we are doing this via Zoom, we thought we'd do a few little Zoom kind of ground rules. We will ask you to turn off your microphones and turn off your video, since we do have such a large number of people attending, at least through the whole group discussion sessions. Clearly in the breakout sessions, we want you to have your video on, your microphone on, and actively participate. Also, if you want to ask questions, make comments, there is the chat feature that you can activate and post your questions there for the large sessions. So for those of you, just as a reminder, CBMS is an umbrella organization of currently 19 professional societies, all of which have their primary objectives, the increase or diffusion of knowledge in one of the mathematical sciences. The purpose of CBMS is to provide a forum to bring these national organizations together so we can collaborate and support each other in our efforts to improve mathematics education, mathematics research, and expand the uses of mathematics. And this is the list of our current societies. The goal of our mathematics alignment project is to help state leadership teams draw on the expertise of our societies and also our partner, the Dana Center, to coordinate efforts across grades 11 to 14 that will lead your states to create policies and practices for mathematics instruction that contribute to successful completion of mathematics without reducing quality for each and every student. The states we have participating are listed here. I know some of you each of you have been working together closely with cohorts, sub-states, and during this forum, you'll have an opportunity to share the work that you've been doing with the other states that are participating. In particular, here's the objectives for this forum. I'm not going to read this to you, you can read it. Today, most of our work will focus on objective 1, which is reflecting on the work we've already done and sharing the knowledge that we've each gained with each other. Through the 3 days of our forum, we want to thank our speakers that are taking their time to contribute to our learning. We thank each and every one of them for being willing to share their experiences and knowledge with us. I also want to acknowledge the activities and resources that CBMS societies have produced over the past 18 months since we last got together. On the CBMS homepage, there is a societies resource page that talks about the work that the societies have been doing, both in terms of support for instruction during the time of COVID, but also more generally thinking through equity issues and other kinds of support. So I would encourage you to take some time and look at the resources that are on that page. There's just a wealth of things posted from our various member societies. I also want to just highlight some particular new resources that may be helpful to you in your alignment work. At our first forum back in 2019, NCTM had just published its Catalyzing Change in High School Mathematics, Initiating Critical Conversations. Since that time, they've now produced 2 companion reports. one for catalyzing change in middle school mathematics and the other in early childhood and elementary mathematics. Each of these publications has recommendations for the 4 cross-cutting themes you see below. So I strongly recommend you take a look at that. There's something very much, very useful recommendations, suggestions, and also citing research evidence regarding equitable structures, equitable mathematics instruction, etc. Building on that, NCSM, Leadership in Mathematics Education, just recently published a positions statement, position paper, Closing the Opportunity Gap, a call for detracking in mathematics. This will be the focus on one of our breakout sessions on Tuesday, next Tuesday, October 13th. I would strongly encourage that you read through that ahead of time. That's one of the things we mentioned in our reading list. And I also want to highlight work that's being done by SIAM, NCTM, and COMAP as part of joint committees in support of modeling across the curriculum. You maybe remember that the GAME report, Guidelines for Assessment and Instruction in Mathematical Modeling Education, was published in 2016. Since then, these joint committees have been working on strategies and practices to help support the infusion of modeling across the curriculum. Saul Garfunkel, the executive director of COMAP, who's one of the sponsors not only of the committee, but also of the GAME report, will be joining us next Tuesday to share strategies and learnings in terms of the benefits of engaging students in modeling and how we can do that effectively across K-16. And last but not least, you might be interested in a new initiative from AAAS. This is their STEM Equity Achievement Project, Sea Change. And what they're working on is to help higher education institutions enact structural change to address equity. 2 of our member societies, AMS and ASA, have been representing mathematics in the work on Sea Change. Just recently, Sea Change released a list of draft guidelines for university departments for self-evaluation in terms of their structures for supporting equitable practices and outcomes. That draft document, which is to apply to all STEM fields, is available for comments until October 9th. In addition, MAA, the Mathematics Association of America, is working on a similar initiative specifically designed for mathematics departments to do this kind of self-study and evaluation in terms of their policies and practices and supporting equitable participation and outcomes. There are 3 other recent publications that may also be helpful to your work, although they're not publications specifically of CBMS. The National Research Council has released 2 different reports. The first, Increasing Student Success in Developmental Mathematics, was released 2 years ago in talking about what universities can be doing and programs can be doing to improve student outcomes. And more recently, the NRC produced Building Educational Equity Indicator Systems. Again, guidelines for departments in terms of doing self-study. What would those what would those indicators be in terms of having an equitable system? And finally, very recently, David Versood published an article on calculus and its role in equitable practices. Links to all 3 of these reports are available in our reading list, so I would strongly encourage you to take a look at them because I think they have a lot to say in terms of our work and very specific recommendations that we can take advantage of and build on. Our partner, CBMS's partner in this work, is the Dana Center. Most of us are familiar with the Dana Center, and its charge is to advance public education at scale, and it does it in 3 different ways. They've got teams that work across K-12. They also have a focus on equity and access to ensure that each and every student has relevant mathematics and is successful in it. And they also have nearly 30 years of experience in bringing this understanding to large-scale systems. So the areas of focus in the Dana Center are their K-12 mathematics and science work. They're also doing work bridging K-12 and higher education in their new Launch Years initiative. And they've also been doing work in terms of higher education and advancement. Some of you are familiar with the work they've done in terms of pathways regarding two-year college pathways, et cetera. So we're very pleased that the Dana Center is our partner in this work. They bring a great deal of expertise and really helpful strategies as we as teams think through how we can improve the equitable practices and effective equitable pathways from K-12 to higher education. Today, we're going to be doing a kickoff in terms of equitable practices. I'll introduce our speaker in a moment, and then we'll have an opportunity to take a look at key learnings from 3 of our partner states. Then later in the day, we'll have an opportunity for roll-alike sessions across different partner states. So we'll have an opportunity to come together. And finally, we're trying something different at the end of the day, which we're calling an unconference session, was a chance for you to engage in unstructured conversation with a subset of speakers from today, just to share ideas, kind of like we would do at a conference if we were having the reception afterwards. So have a chance to just engage in some informal conversation in terms of reflections on the day. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker. Let me get her bio here, Maria Echaveste. She is the president of the Opportunity Institute, which is a not-for-profit focused on increasing social and economic mobility and advancing racial equity. Before that, she built a distinguished career working as a consultant, lecturer, senior White House official, longtime community leader, and corporate attorney. Echaveste has also been a senior fellow at the University of Berkeley's Center for Latin American Studies since 2008. She also served in various capacities in President Clinton's administration, including assistant to the president and deputy White House chief of staff from 1998 to 2001, director of the White House Office of Public Liaison, and wage and hour administrator of the U.S. Department of Labor. She currently serves on the board of directors of the UCSF Benioff Oakland Children's Hospital, CADES Inc., which is a publicly held natural resources company, Mia Familia Vota, and SMASH, formerly known as Level Playing Field Institute, focusing on improving STEM education for students of color. Echaveste received a BA from Stanford University and a JD from UC Berkeley School of Law. So it's my pleasure to turn the podium over to Maria Echaveste. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Diane. And thank you all for inviting me to join you at your fall forum. I suspect that many of you, like me, were looking forward to seeing each other in person and gathering in the fall weather. And instead, we are becoming Zoombies after months of looking at computer screens. Yet, we are grateful that technology allows us, some of us, fortunate enough to have the skills and education to be able to continue to work and be productive, even in the middle of a pandemic, and to do so from the safety of our own homes. So many others are either unemployed or risking their health as essential workers to keep us safe. fed, and providing needed services. Many of you, like me, were already focused on issues of equity before COVID-19 arrived and disrupted our lives, our communities, our schools, our entire way of living. And many of you were also acutely aware before the murder of George Floyd on May 25th of this year of the role of racism in creating and continuing so many of the inequities that adversely affect the health, education, and lives of so many African Americans especially, but also others such as Native Americans, Latinos, Hispanic Americans, and other marginalized communities. This pandemic, together with the racial reckoning that has the attention of so many more people than ever before, I believe creates an opportunity for real progress, real transformative change. Why? Because the pandemic revealed in stark terms that you simply could not ignore the racial inequities in who lived, who dies, who gets to work from home, who continues to be educated because they have internet access and sufficient devices. I want to recognize that many of you have been working for more than a year to, and I'm quoting from the launch year's paper, improve secondary to post-secondary mathematics alignment and student transitions in your states, responding to the call to the launch year's initiative led by the Dana Center at UT Austin, along with all the partners. It's because you've recognized that one of the most urgent education issues is ensuring equitable access to an excellent and progressively more advanced mathematics education for all students. So I want, in this brief time that we have, to put your work in a larger context and say part of the reason that I said yes to this is I am one of those students who started college intending to be a math major. The goal, the dream I had was to be an astronaut. However, calculus at 8 a.m. was not quite the schedule that worked for me. And even now, though, I love math and often tease my husband that we should take a math class together just to keep the brain cells working. So thank you for this opportunity. So the larger context, I want to talk about three things: equity indicators, the future of work, and why this is really a racial justice imperative. Let's recognize that in the last few months in particular, we've heard the word equity used a lot. But what do we really mean by that? How do we measure progress towards equity? And in answering that question, I want to distinguish between societal responsibility and individual responsibility. Our country, for the last 40 to 50 years, has been on a trend or a direction that has really elevated the role of the individual and focused on the individual putting all the hard work, all their energy, and succeeding or not succeeding. And the way you're poor because you made the wrong decisions, you dropped out of college, or you dropped out of high school, or you had a child when you were a teenager. And I think that we need to take a step back and say, wait a minute, especially because of the awareness of the structural inequities in our society. How much does society, what role does society have towards leveling that playing field so that individual strengths and potentials can be unleashed? And the example I always use is if a child, I know of someone who excellent high school education, really top notch, dropped out of Swarthmore freshman year, decided to be a musician, to be a poet. Thank goodness for Obamacare. Became a carpenter, great. Society gave that person the tools to make decisions and decide for himself how he wanted to live his life. Can we really hold a comparable young man growing up in Fruitvale or East Oakland, going to a mediocre or less than mediocre school, high school, surrounded by violence, surrounded by economic stresses, to that same standard and say it's your fault that you are not succeeding, you're not productive? So the world I want to see is one where there is a societal responsibility, but also to recognize that there is individual responsibility. We need to find that balance. And one way of considering sort of what is society responsible for comes from the work, and I think it was in your pre-reading, which was, or at least referenced, the National Academies of Science report released in 2019, Monitoring Educational Equity. And there they define educational equity as requiring that educational opportunity be calibrated to need, which may include additional and tailored resources and supports to create conditions of true opportunity. This idea of equity is different from equality, which connotes the idea that certain goods and services are distributed evenly, irrespective of individual needs or assets. And I think it's important to have that definition in mind, because I, like so many of you, grew up with this belief that our country provided equal opportunity, that we were all equal under the law, that we had equal access. And of course, as history has taught us, that equal access has not been made real for so many. But this report, and it's a panel, if those of you who are familiar with the National Academies of Science, convenes these panels, looks at the research and builds a consensus, is seeking to, has proposed a set of indicators that can really help guide governments, districts, states, localities on how to allocate resources to ensure educational opportunity. So there are a number of domains, including kindergarten readiness, that then looks at one indicator is are the disparities in academic readiness or disparities in self-regulation and attention skills. And there I want to put an asterisk, because there's so much work now on the social, emotional, and academic development, and the need for our education system to really, our teachers and the adults in our schools, to really understand the science of learning and development and adjust their teaching methods, curriculum, and other supports to really maximize providing the opportunity to children of all incomes, of all races. But the indicators continue by looking at disparities in educational attainment, whether there's access to high quality teachers. There's also a look at the disparities in students' exposure to racial, ethnic, and economic segregation, access to high quality early learning programs. Critically, it's looking at the disparities in school climate, in school discipline, disparities in non-academic supports. the goal of this report, and I'll confess that here at the Opportunity Institute, we're partnering with other organizations. How do we try to influence states and localities to adopt these indicators as a way of providing concrete data against which we can measure whether we're making progress? You all know better than anyone, I think. You get what you measure. In a way, we could have a whole discussion on the pluses and minuses of, say, No Child Left Behind, and the focus on the fourth grade reading test and eighth grade examinations, and the accountability that was trying to be built into that system. And yet what we found is so much focus on the tests, and tying some efforts to tie pay and performance evaluations to how children performed on those tests. You get what you measure. And so this report by the National Academies of Science is suggesting, if we measure the disparities in what children actually are able to access, it will help us find those levers for making change, for improving what we're all interested in, which is high academic performance by all students, so that they can reach their potential and go on to whatever post-secondary education they desire, because they have a solid foundation. The reason this becomes, even apart from the moral reasons for wanting to ensure equal access to opportunity, there's also the economic imperative. We are seeing right now, because of this pandemic, an economy that is accelerating in terms of transit, and we were already in transition because of technology and automation. McKinsey, everyone's favorite consulting firm, I say that jokingly. However, they do come out with some very interesting reports. Several years ago on the future of work globally, and what it meant, the automation, what it meant for manufacturing, what it meant for the economies of developing countries, especially in Africa and Asia, and a real concern about automation. And we're now, because of the pandemic, there are just some jobs that manufacturers are going to be looking, how can we do that with robots? But even here in our country, we have real differences between rural versus urban. And one of those key areas is, as we've seen in this pandemic, is access to broadband, access to the internet, access to devices. The McKinsey report, which looks at cities and counties across the country, evaluating them as to their potential for continuing to grow on an economic level, really highlights the problem. And by the way, I'm going to send these sites to Diane and David, just so you'll have them in case you want to do some further research. But the millions of jobs can be phased out even as new ones are created. And the day-to-day nature of work, as we've seen now, is going to change. Now, one question that has troubled me and others as we look at the future of work, recognize technology is going to keep progressing because that is the nature of human innovation. I will say that I do really question why we need driverless cars, because why is that a need? But they're coming, and that means that thousands upon thousands of truck drivers may be out of jobs before the not too distant future. So technology just is, it's going to keep, we're going to be innovating, we're going to be creating. But what happens? What happens especially to communities, poor communities, marginalized communities? What happens to students who are not getting the education that they will need in order to get the skills, the higher skills, in order to succeed in the changing economy? This is extremely urgent. If we look at a recent report issued by Deutsche Bank, released in September, America's Racial Gap and Big Tech's Closing Window, they analyzed using a number of models, some of which I am not fully familiar with, but I think some of you as being more experts will recognize. But what they concluded, what this report concluded, was that 76% of Blacks and 62% of Hispanics, their words in this report, could get shut out or be underprepared for 86% of the jobs in the US by 2045. 76% of Blacks, 62% of Hispanics could be shut out for 86% of jobs in the US by 2045. If that is not a sobering call to action, I don't know what is. Because why? Because the student population is increasingly minority, soon not to be minority, increasingly students of color, and increasingly students from lower income. This digital racial gap, if it's not addressed, in one generation could result in a even greater underclass than we have now. So the good thing is that there's a report by the Pew Trust that there are over 20 states that are considering or in the process of passing legislation to really address the broadband issue, the digital divide, that has become so glaring, as distance learning has taken place. But that's only a beginning. You can have internet, you can have devices, but if you look at the statistics of who has actually been participating in remote learning, in Los Angeles Unified School District, almost a third of the students in those first 6 months, this last spring, were not checking in to their online remote learning classes. And the schools varied in their capacity to track down those students or contact the families. And there is a deep, deep fear in this, with both last spring and the current environment of this school year, of real learning loss or instructional loss, however you want to call it. But for a chunk of students who were already at risk, if you will, because of their circumstances, losing a year, losing 2 years, we know the data tells us what happens as when you get further behind. And especially as you hit the middle school and high school, and those issues of esteem and peer pressure, etc., we lose more and more. So this is a crisis. All right. One solution is going back to the science of learning and development, is neuroscience tells us that adversity, trauma, poverty impact human development, that affect a child's ability to learn. But it also shows us that the brain is very malleable. And with the right interventions, with the right supports, you can help a child learn and succeed. So part of this work began by Pam Cantor at Turnaround for Children. And it came in the wake of the 9/11 attack with pediatricians. She was a pediatrician in New York City and saw a natural experiment and wanted to know, how does this traumatic event impact children's learning, their educational growth? As she studied in New York, she discovered that yes, that one event was traumatic, but what was more impactful on a child's ability to learn was the trauma at home, the adversity of living in violent neighborhoods, the low income, economic stress, homelessness. That was much more impactful. So what does this all mean for us, for you, for education? There's the concept of whole child equity. And some of the indicators in that report I referenced from the NAS looks at the availability of those non-academic supports. How do you integrate services and supports while still improving teaching and learning so that the potential of every individual student can be unleashed? I believe that this moment, as I said, both the pandemic, but also our awareness of the systemic racism that has led to such inequalities, coupled with the economic tsunami that is facing states and cities and districts, presents an opportunity to bring all those resources together. For example, everyone is talking about the need for mental health for students as they come to school, as well as the adults, right? Mental health is now, I think we're getting away from the stigma as we recognize that our mental health is key to being productive and being able to work or being able to study. Well, what's a low-income school district supposed to do when they've got to also provide some safe place for students to come in? Why should the school district pay for those mental health services? How do you access the county and the state of California? Children's mental health services is allocated or administered by the county mental health office. However, California ranks like 47th in the country in accessing mental health services under Medi-Cal, the Medicaid program. In part because there are barriers and obstacles in terms of reimbursement that are stopping schools from accessing those resources. And I use that as an example of, especially right now with so many budget cuts, states are going to be looking at their budgets come January. Cuts are being proposed across the board. How do you take the government resources, let's think of it, societal responsibility, and actually use the resources we do have in a more efficient, more effective way to protect and provide the services to our most vulnerable children and families? I believe that a whole child equity approach that recognizes the importance of relationships, of non-academic supports, of changing the school climate, so that especially students of color don't feel like they're not respected as students. So many high school students speak of just the fear is too strong a word, but the stress of going to school and feeling like they're just biding time. So the work that you're all doing in aligning math to post-secondary to really address issues of access to quality, high standards math, because math is such a important gateway, if you will, such a foundational element to education, to being well educated, needs to continue. And I applaud the Dana Center and all of you for taking on that work. I know that there are state plans that folks are working on, and my own work in education makes me realize how hard that work is, because you can get a policy adopted at either a federal or a state level, but actually getting it implemented in a classroom and training teachers on different approaches, that is retail work that is time consuming, that almost feels like proselytizing, but is so necessary if we're ever going to change what happens in the classroom. Again, we're not saying that schools and teachers have to solve every issue and problem that a child comes in with, but because schools are the ones for the government system that for a number of years children and families have a connection to, it becomes an entry point for identifying issues and addressing issues that may be impacting a child's ability to learn. So, equity indicators, the future of our economy, the future of work requires a highly educated workforce. I'll give you an anecdote. We're doing some work on career technical education in the South. It turns out that Alabama has sought to workforce development, big issue, attracted a number of manufacturing, auto and shipbuilding. They are 500,000 people, workers short, because they don't have the skills and the training for these manufacturing jobs. And that's just one state. So how do we monitor progress towards equity? How do we put an equity lens on the future of work so that as the economy changes, the traditionally marginalized communities don't get left behind yet again? How do we change our current system of education to provide a whole child equity approach so that the adversity outside of the classroom does not become a barrier to that education that we absolutely need and are working toward? So let me stop there, Diane, and perhaps open it up for questions.
Thank you so much. So we've just opened up the chat for questions. You've given us an awful lot to think about in terms of opportunities. I wonder if you kind of waiting for other people to comment. Wonder if you'd say a little bit more. You mentioned Alabama. Are there other are there particular models or something that's happening that you're very enthused about that you're saying, here's some ways or some suggestions or some policies people are taking that are really getting at these issues that some of the rest of us should look at or be aware of?
There's work that's gone on in Colorado in terms of one of the issue is apprenticeships. That our country did not, we often look at Europe and particularly Germany, but others as well, where companies and government have worked together to build the pipeline of the workers they're going to need, right? In our case, we left vocational training to the side, and let's acknowledge that for many years it was used as a way of tracking and segregating who was going to go to college and who was going to, become a plumber. However, we have to recognize that there are good middle-class jobs if we can provide the education and training. We know healthcare, for example, is a growth area. And there are technician jobs but one of the issues is, for example, to be a radiation technician in the state of California, you have to put something like 1,200 hours as apprentice. That is unpaid. So who has, especially if you're a low-income person who got some student debt to get through those 2-3 years of college and now wants to do this, where are they going? So there, both in California and Colorado, there were government efforts to, not huge, but to put some money for paid apprenticeships. In Europe, the companies contribute to that pool. Those, it's something like that where you public-private, right? So it isn't just government, but companies also have Verizon and is partnering in a couple of states because they need technicians. So that's one area. But we in this country have been so adverse to having a industrial policy. We don't want to pick winners and losers. So we let the market decide. Well, I really think we have to revisit that.
Okay, we got another question that I just lost. Okay, this is a question from Nancy Shapiro. She asks, imagine a new education-friendly federal government administration. What is on your wish list?
Well, I'll tell you a couple of things. One is taking that equity indicators report and building a federal system, but doing it in the way that actually we build in continuous improvement, right? Because some, as you'll see when you read the report, there are some databases that don't exist, or we're not quite sure how to measure that indicator. Let's keep learning in the same way we do with NAEP. There's a national, a governing board that looks at science, research, data-based, research-based way of starting somewhere and then keep building. So that would be one. And the second would be incentives for cities and states to get their various social service agencies to work with schools to build that whole child equity, right? So something to get folks understanding bureaucracies are bureaucracies. And with all, I was a bureaucrat, I understand. You have a job, you have a mission. Can you get them to actually work together?
Sounds great. Another question is from Kendall Brown, talking about so much emphasis in K-12 is on college prep. Are we ignoring 80% of our students who won't go to college?
Absolutely.
And are there specific things we might be doing there?
Yes. And I didn't mention it, but there is a report called Striving to Thriving, which was put out by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Equitable Futures. And what it did was take a look at research on occupational identity, especially among Black and Latino students. And the couple of things that came out of that report is in fact, and I think has some implications for math and how math is taught, right? Which is so many students sort of take their high school classes, but they see no relevance to their lived lives or what they can imagine. And exposure to different occupations through not just a field trip, but actual exposure academies. There's a school in Sacramento that's a biotech academy that is really trying to connect their biology, their math to the health fields. I think those are promising ways of getting folks to understand, students to imagine a different future for them. But I also think to the point about so much attention on colleges, for some reason, we don't respect, I think we've lost respect for workers working, the dignity of work. And you're still going to need plumbers. You're still going to need electricians, as we all know. How do we restore dignity to those professions? Mm-hmm. I know I can't do a dang thing in my state, right? So there's something about a disdain for work that involves manual labor. And I think we need a deep cultural shift there. So I don't know quite how to do that, but yeah, we need to be thinking about all the careers, all the professions, all the ways, as we see right now, who's essential, right? Mm-hmm. Who's essential?
Okay, so I want to thank you so much, and glad you're going to be joining us again at the end of the day. As we mentioned at the last session of the day, 3 Central, 4 Eastern, we're going to have an unconference session. So Maria has agreed to come on and host one of those unconference sessions. So if you have some other conversation and questions for her, you'll have an opportunity to have a more intimate conversation then. So thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure, really. Thank you for this opportunity. Bye.
Thank you. So at this point, we're going to take a few minute break and then come back on the hour for our first of our key learning sessions. And Doug Savdi